Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our new season of the Classical Academy podcast. This is your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I am your new host, Dr. Mark Phillips. Just a little bit about me as we get started. I have had many past lives: animal surgeon, analytical biochemist, pastor, missionary, was a radio host at one time. I even did a short stint as a professional stand-up comedian, thanks to Steve Martin, who got me started in that world. And now I'm serving as Trinity's chair of the Department of Theology and Science. Very excited about my guest today. It's Chris Leigh, upper school humanities teacher. He's the dean of our house system. He's considered to be Trinity's resident foodie, master of strategy games, strong as an ox, wise as a serpent, gentle as an angry ram. He's a founding teacher here at Trinity's upper school, and he really did help set out the scope and the sequence of our humanities curriculum. He has seen it all. So welcome, Chris. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Why do we study the great books? I mean, this season we're going to be talking about the great books that we look at here at Trinity. And people hear that and they wonder, what are the great books? That sounds very intimidating. Why do we delve into these books? And then we'll specifically talk about the Iliad in a moment.
Sure. Why read these fantastic collection of books that everybody seems to talk about? I always like to say, especially in the context of a school, you want to learn from the best. And the great books are proven by time to be the best books that have endured. Everybody knows, no disrespect to Harry Potter. I love Harry Potter.
Sure.
Pick your favorite fiction. Hopefully, I doubt it, but hopefully Chronicles of Narnia, something like that, may make the cut. But really, you got to wait 100 years before we know if you're even a really good book. Everybody likes you today, but we start to lose traction after a little bit of time. When we talk about a great book, we're talking about a book that's been relevant for literally longer than anyone alive knew anyone that was alive when it was written, right? It goes on and on and on. Some of these books, like the one we're going to be talking about today, you're talking about over 3,000 years that we're still considering and still thinking about. There's something magical about that. I'm a historian. It's all about that time and space continuum, right? We get to think the same thoughts that they were thinking about when they were so far away. It's amazing.
Wow, fantastic. Well, and so specifically the Iliad, we are a classical Christian school. So people say, wow, what does Greek mythology have to do with Christianity? What does the Iliad mean to the Christian? Why study it from the perspective of Christianity? Why study it from the perspective of a classical school?
Right. Why would we need to know about Zeus or Achilles or any of that?
Yeah.
And I think really when it comes down to it, because we're also not Greek, by the way, but the Iliad is probably one of the two greatest books of the Western world. Basically, if you're living in the West, you live in a world that was created by the Bible and by Homer, specifically Homer's Iliad. That's why we read it. It is the greatest of the greats.
Wow.
You have to read it.
And so what is what's the context that when we're approaching the Iliad, what context do we bring to our minds, to our hearts, to our very lives when we're going into the Iliad?
So the Iliad is all about what it means to be a human. It's a book that starts in war, it unfolds in war, and it ends in war. There is no end to that conflict. And, when a seventh grader reads that, it's a fantastic way to appeal to a seventh grader. But the context that we're trying to help our students see, that we ourselves are attempting to occupy when we're looking at this book, is to understand what it means to be human in a world filled with conflict, in a world where justice does sometimes seem to fall on the side of those that are stronger than us, and not necessarily to be meted out in some sort of court, to have to try and understand that there is such a thing as the right side. And if you're on the wrong side, even if you have virtues, your virtues might actually be vices, because all of your goodness is in the service of something evil. That's wrong. There's so much there to unpack in that way.
And so that takes us to the mind of the author, Homer himself. And before we take a short break, one more question. Who, and I know this could take an hour to answer, but who was Homer?
Who was Homer? Not Homer Simpson, to be clear. Homer is often, most myths say he was blind because, it's one of those ancient bargains that the gods give us, right? If you are physically blind, that's because you get to see so much of what is true and real beyond the physical world. Homer he's not even a contemporary of the events that he's writing about. He is the first greatest poet of the Western world. His story, the story of the men fighting at Troy, the Iliad references Ilium, which is one of the names for the city of Troy. So it's not the story of Achilles, it's not the story of Hector, it's the story of Troy. His story is essentially the first Western poem written down. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh and whatnot. That's great. The big one is Homer's Iliad. He is the poet. The Greeks are the ones that give us our understanding of philosophy and theater, and they're going to have all of that other massive spread of what Western civilization looks like, and all of them are springing from the soil of Homer and his original poem.
So to really understand the foundations of Western culture,
you have
with
to
the
get
Iliad.
with Homer. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very good.
If you're not with Homer, then you simply are not going to be able to understand what the West really is.
Fantastic. Well, listen, we'll be back after this short break. Stay with us. Welcome back to part 2 of our podcast with Chris Leigh. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. Listen, gang, if you are enjoying the podcast, please subscribe, give us a review, and most important, share this podcast with any friends, with any family who need a user-friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I think it's one of the big hopes for Western civilization, so spread the word, and we would love to hear from you. Contact us at podcast@trinityclassicalacademy.com. It's easy enough to remember. Podcast, this is a podcast at trinityclassicalacademy.com, or you can go to social media at the Classical Academy Podcast. What did you like about it? What do you want more of? We want to hear from you. Help us put this thing together. So we're back with Chris Leigh. We're talking about the Iliad. You mentioned some characters in the first segment. Of course, opening with our protagonist, Achilles. Who is he? What is his state? What is the hope for his personal development? And who are some of these other characters we should be looking at? Hector and Paris and Helen and all those people.
Sure. Well, and not surprisingly, Achilles, some of us just know him because our ankles occasionally get tweaked. He's famous for having a bad ankle because he is a demigod, a god or a man born of a river goddess and a man, Peleus, who was awarded a special prize by Zeus, king of the gods. She dipped him in the river Styx, making him invulnerable to all damage, but in order to keep a hold of him, held him by his heel, his ankle, and that is his, legendary weakness. If something can hit him there, you would think, well, then just wear really good shoes. But the point is, he's basically an invulnerable superstar, truly just an impossible enemy to overcome, except for one small fatal flaw. So I think you can already begin to see how he's a dynamic character that captures our imaginations. How many times have we had someone who's amazing, but they always have that one little thing, that kind of goofy thing that might take you down. We have Hector, who is his sort of opposite. Hector is just a man. He is, and when I say just a man, I don't mean that to denigrate him, but he doesn't have a goddess as a mother. He is a man born of a man and a woman, and he is the eldest son of Priam of Troy, the king of the city of Troy. He is, as the crown prince, the great defender, the best warrior on the Trojan side, man-killing Hector, as he's often called, brilliant, strong, totally doomed, cannot possibly hope to overcome Achilles, and we know that from the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
The Iliad begins with this terrific line, right? I'm just going to do it in English because I would fail at it in Greek, but it starts out, rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, right? The murderous doom that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many fighters' souls, brave fighters' souls, right? All because Achilles has this, not anger, he's not upset. I've taught the Iliad for several years, and one of the best discussions we have is, have you ever had rage? Rage is not something we typically encounter. And when a man like Achilles, when a demigod like Achilles encounters an emotion like that, something that burns red, that actually would lead you to murder, would probably be the only thing that we in common parlance could recognize it. But, or, if you had gone to war, which, I haven't, and most of our students, of course, not, but they might be able to recognize it and would speak to a civilization, a group of people that had war as part of their experience. Rage is something. Hector's up against the impossible.
So let's go into an overview, especially for those who may not be familiar with the Iliad. Let's kind of go into an overview. What's the setting? What's going on here in this story, the Iliad?
Set the table, right?
Yes, sir.
Sure. When we come to the Iliad, this is in the 9th year of a war that goes for 10 years. So as you can tell, we're coming to the story a little bit late. The story actually has its roots with the second son of the king of Troy, a guy named Paris. And as the name might suggest, he's maybe not our most masculine, rough and tumble warrior prince. He's more on the hello ladies kind of prince
lover.
Exactly. And he comes to visit the king of Sparta, a guy named Menelaus, who is famous not just for being the king of Sparta, but for having the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, as his wife. And Menelaus greets him and feasts him, and it's a grand old time. And then Menelaus decides to go off on a hunt, and he invites Paris to go with him, and Paris says, no, I think I'm good. So Menelaus leaves, and he's gone for several days. Comes back to his home to discover that his guest, Paris, has absconded both with his wife and with his treasure.
Uh-oh.
This is actually not just an uh-oh. This is essentially, I know most of us would be scandalized by that to begin with, but in the Greek world, and this is something that we can probably relate to, there is no higher sacred standard than that of hospitality. If I welcome you into my home, then you have been welcomed in, and I will protect you, and you should, of course, honor me as your host. That you would take advantage of me when I have welcomed you in, there is no greater sin. That you would take a man's wife in battle, that might be one thing, but to take a man's wife when he invited you into his home, you are the lowest of the low. Now, because it's the most beautiful woman in the world, turns out all of the Greeks, known at the time as the Achaeans, they've actually all promised to come to the aid of her husband should anyone ever take a move against her. And therefore, all of Greece is now engaged. They're on the hook. They've promised to the gods they will go to war, and so they set off. There's a lot to get them to Troy, in which Achilles has a couple of different things that make him notable already, puts him on a path to have a conflict with the king of kings named Agamemnon, who's the leader of the Greeks. But essentially, they get to Troy, and now they've been fighting for 9 years. You might ask yourself, why on earth would it take so long to fight a war? I mean, 9 years. Well, this is in Bronze Age wartime, and so, first of all, they don't have the weapons that just make killing each other super simple. It's a lot of wearing down and beating on each other. Notably, great heroes probably, and this is one of those fun things as a historian where there's some overlap, great heroes probably had armor and weapons that were made out of lighter and stronger metals like iron and possibly even steel. Like Achilles is known as the brilliant runner, the great runner Achilles. That's because he's fast. Speed is the difference between life and death in the battlefield. Nevertheless, it just means a long time of grueling, terrible warfare. These men have been away from their families forever. They are done with it. They want to go home. And we pick up in the final year, they know in year 10, finally we're going to be done. We're going to see this thing through finally, and it's going to come to an end. And Agamemnon, the Lord of Men, as he's described, decides to pick a fight with Achilles. And even though Achilles is the greatest warrior in the Greek army, he wants to, as we've talked about this earlier, he feels like that means that he's entitled to be right against even the king. But unfortunately, the king is the king, and when you're not the king, if the king says, I'm right, you're wrong, that's just the way it is. And even mighty Achilles can't overthrow heaven in that respect.
So what happens as a result of this breach?
Well, now you've got the authority, the king of the Greeks, and the greatest warrior of the Greeks in a divide. Achilles says, I'm out. Fine, go win the war on your own. And he goes and he sits in his tents and he refuses to send his men. He's not going to go and fight himself. Agamemnon arrogantly thinks that he doesn't need Achilles, and so they end up in a fight with Troy. And Hector, it turns out, when he's not facing Achilles, Hector is able to do some amazing things. At one point, he doesn't listen to the old men of his city who say, please don't go out, please stay within the walls and you'll be safe. And they're not wrong, he would be safe, but there's no glory there, and there's no chance to actually finish this fight. So he ignores their advice and he drives the Achaeans back to their ships, and then the Achaeans have built a sort of makeshift wall on the beach, and Hector picks up a rock, and the text says, it's a rock so big no 3 men could lift it, weak as men are today. But Hector picks it up himself, and he throws it by himself just straight through the timber wall, and it explodes in this like shattering rain of splinters and fire, and he breaches the wall and screaming to his men, the ships, burn the ships! Wow. And they're driving the Achaeans, and death is there. And that is the moment when Achilles' best friend, a guy named Patroclus, goes to Achilles and says, if you're not going to save the Greeks, at least let me put on your armor and I will go save them. And Achilles says, okay, you can put on my armor, you may get them away from the ships, but that's it, and don't fight Hector. Now, of course, anyone that's familiar with fairy tales should know, anytime someone tells a character, you can do this, but don't do that, be on the lookout for them to do that very thing.
Expect him to fight Hector.
It's almost like the history of man is being told, don't do this one thing, and then don't eat from that tree. Oh, wait. Maybe.
Yes.
Right. So Patroclus does put on the armor and does drive them off of the ships, and then he sees Hector, and he's doing so well, he thinks, I could do this. I could get victory for my side. And he attacks Hector, and Hector lays him out and kills him, thinking he's killed mighty Achilles. He's super exultant and praising himself to everybody. I am awesome. Rips off the helmet only to discover he's killed Achilles' best friend. And you can imagine, Hector goes from total triumph, I have won the day, saved my city, to in the very next moment realized I have done the one thing that would get Achilles to come back to the battle. I've killed his best friend, and I did it, so he's coming for me. Hector is doomed.
Now, how is so Hector's response then? Is he more forlorn for himself or for the city, or is that clear in the text?
That's a great question. Hector, I like to think of Hector as the most sympathetic, virtuous bad guy probably you've ever read about. To the Greeks, it would have been very clear that the Trojans were the baddies. As every UCLA fan, I'm sure, can understand, the Trojans are evil. The breach, the sin of Paris, puts Troy irrevocably on the side of doom. They have been marked for doom, and the gods, if the gods are just in heaven, the impiety of the Trojans cannot go unanswered. Hector is a good man. He loves his father. He loves his mother, loves his city, loves his wife. There's a very touching scene where he comes in, and his son, little Astyanax, is afraid of the massive man of grime and war and his helmet. Hector doesn't pay any attention to Helen, won't soften for anybody, but he takes off his helmet for his little son. And that's really touching.
Sure.
And if you know the story, you know that after when it's all over, the Greeks are going to be brutal. They're going to take Hector's wife into slavery. They're going to throw his little son off of the top of the wall onto the rocks and destroy him. And that's enough to make you really pity him. But there's something you need to remember. When a man who knows what is right stands on the side that is wrong, he's no longer innocent, right? We have lots of examples of that. Erwin Rommel in World War II, Robert E. Lee in the Civil War, whatever the narrative is, there's always like, well, some men of great honor, men of these great virtues, but their great virtues were in the service of the evil side, and that doesn't work.
So how does this shape students? How does studying the Iliad shape students? I mean, you started there. That's fantastic. What I can imagine it's wonderful.
I think especially because we're reading it with our students when they're in 7th grade and they are themselves becoming aware of some of the larger questions that start to face all of us as we enter into adulthood, the pull of right and wrong, honor, glory, rage, ambition. These are the many heavily spirited urges that pull at all of us. And I think that it's great for our students to see such a vivid, massive epic, really, of characters that embody all of these characteristics in their fullness, in their absolute magnitude, and to see, are there things that are admirable about each of these characters? Yes. Would you want to be any one of these characters? I think pretty universally, almost all of us agree we don't want to be almost anyone in the Iliad. They're almost all of them a little cursed, and it's always some vice that is so vividly attached to their virtue. And so it's to see, it's wonderful. And the Greeks would have been telling these stories to their children. They would have memorized the Iliad for the purposes of being able to remind each other, don't be a Hector, don't be an Achilles, or do be a Hector, do be Achilles in their best virtues, but remember that those virtues carry with them the danger of failure.
And that's a wonderful way to look at the Imago Dei and the fallen state, and what a great thing. One last question, and we want to wrap it up here, but let's say there's some parents listening out there, and their child's studying the Iliad, or I may want to stop one day and in the middle of a chemistry lecture and just ask a question. What would be a great question I could ask them about the Iliad?
So I think one of the constant questions that we encounter whenever we read the Iliad, and then it reverberates throughout the rest because this is such a foundational text, is that our students need to wonder who they are in the context of these stories. They need to reflect on how they respond to the call of glory, to the cry for mercy, to the impetus of honor and the opportunity for success, the danger of failure, and of course the weight of rage. I like for them when I was teaching it for my students to have to consider a godlike rage trapped in a human body would be a terrible thing to have to contemplate, and that is what Achilles is engaging with. But at the same time, we are souls, immortal souls, God-breathed souls, enfleshed in these bodies of carbon, and our path is not actually all that divergent from a demigod like Achilles, because we were made to consider eternity. When Homer talks about the struggle of a demigod in Greece long ago, it's easy to think that has nothing to do with us, but the demigod in Greece was a man struggling in the midst of pain and anger, seeking glory, ready to trade his life for the opportunity to have a name that is never forgotten. And I always like to point out to my 7th graders, you can't mock Achilles because I just said his name. And it's been over 3,000 years, and he got what he asked for. He wanted his name to never be forgotten, and we read his story every year, as everyone always has. It is the framing work of what we understand a hero to be. You go to see superhero movies, you see Star Wars, you see cowboy movies. Every one of these, every story that we recognize in the West has a reverberant theme from the Iliad of the hero that is doomed but nevertheless struggles. A hero who is excellent beyond all others but is tragically selfish and more than a little, unfortunately, despicable in the way that he treats others. The cad, that lover boy, Paris, who lets other people die for his selfishness, and you watch the world pay for it, and you wonder, where's the justice? And the gods watch it all. That we see that every day. Every day we walk and work and live and think and do in a society wherein we are pieces of that same puzzle repeating itself, because Homer captured really a slice of humanity in its truest sense. And, especially from a Christian view, we can say, is it the fullness of God's word? Of course it's not the fullness of God's word, but as all truth is God's truth, Homer gave us truly what the world looks like. Apart from the gospel, this is the world. We are in a world where Nietzsche would have, for example, really understood who Achilles was and merely said, yeah, you're on the lookout for the Superman. The Ubermensch is who we're looking for. That's who we all want to be free from having to care about other people and to do what we want. The world of the Iliad is that world, but told in such a vibrant way that we can actually relate to it and see ourselves in stories that allow us to understand.
Oh, man. Wow. I mean, if you do not want to read the Iliad after that, then I can't help you. But listen, if you've read it before, read it again, and then I have a question for you and the listening audience. Now you answer the question after you read it or after you read it again. Why is this perhaps the greatest book I ever read? We want to thank you so much for joining us on the Classical Academy podcast presented by Trinity U, which is a service of Trinity Classical Academy right here in Santa Clarita, California. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music as well. So listen, until next time, let's all continue to grow in wisdom, in virtue, and in the love of God. Thank you for being with us.